Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining today for our December Kapnick Strive webinar. My name is Emma Volkert, and I am a wellness coordinator here on the Strive team, and I'll be our host today for this webinar. So in our webinar today, we'll be discussing grief and loss, what it looks like to experience grief, cope with it, and help support others who also might be grieving. We know that the holidays can be a really difficult time for people who have had a loss, even if that loss took place many years ago. So we felt like it was especially important to discuss this topic this month. So starting out with some standard definitions, just so we're all on the same page. Grief is our body's emotional and physical response to a loss that we've experienced. It's the suffering that you feel when something or someone you love is taken away from you. Often that pain of that loss can feel really overwhelming. You might experience all kinds of difficult and unexpected emotions, from shock or anger to disbelief, guilt, extreme sadness, or numbness. The pain of grief can also disrupt your physical health, making it harder to sleep, eat, or even think straight. So every human experiences a variety of different losses throughout their lives. It might be a non-death loss, so things like losing a relationship, losing a job, moving away from home, receiving a new chronic diagnosis, or even feeling the loss of your personal safety. Or it might be a death loss, losing a parent, a friend, a partner, a child, pets, etc. Whatever loss that you've experienced, it's personal to you. So don't feel ashamed about how you feel or believe that it's somehow only appropriate to grieve for certain things. If that person, animal, relationship, situation was significant to you, it's really normal to grieve that loss. Whatever the cause of that grief, though, there are some healthy ways to cope with the pain that in time can ease your sadness and help you come to terms with that loss, find new meaning, and eventually move forward with your life. So moving into the symptoms of grief. After one experiences any type of loss, whether it's a death loss or a non-death loss, grief can manifest in a variety of different emotional and physical symptoms. So in the first few months after a loss, many people may experience intense sadness and inability to think about anything other than that loss. Some people might also feel emotionally numb or experience some symptoms of depression. It's also possible that someone who recently had a loss is experiencing no emotional symptoms at all, which is known as masked grief. When feelings of grief are either intentionally or unintentionally suppressed, people do tend to experience more of the physical side of things that they might not even realize is connected to that loss. So physically, people who are recently grieving might have problems with their sleep. They might have a lessened appetite. They might experience physical discomfort, things like headaches, nausea, and body fatigue. So during the first few months of grief, many of these signs and symptoms are quite common for many people. If these symptoms do linger for longer than a year after that loss, however, that's when it's a good idea to contact your doctor or a mental health professional to consider a course of treatment. So to help us learn more about what grief can look like, we're now going to walk through a few different models and processes of grief that were developed by social scientists. So this one is likely very familiar to many of you. This is definitely the most well-known model of grief, which is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. And she first proposed these 5 stages in her 1969 book called On Death and Dying. So a lot of people consider this model to be a step-by-step process of grieving, but Kubler-Ross recognizes now that these stages actually aren't linear at all, and some people might not experience all of those stages or any of them. So beginning with denial, this phase often involves disbelief that the loss actually happened. So this state of numbness often happens when our bodies and our brains go into autopilot as a means of protecting us from intense emotions and pain. Some people might experience this kind of numbness so intensely that they even have a hard time remembering this phase of their grief. So while this is a natural defense mechanism of our bodies and our brains, Working towards accepting our loss can help us move forward in grief. The second stage, anger, might occur once you realize that the loss is real and you start to look for ways that you can either blame others for the loss or redirect your pain somehow. And then bargaining often involves an exchange. So for example, someone might say, I promise to devote the rest of my life to helping others, and then maybe the loss won't be real anymore. And guilt is often really present in this stage of bargaining too. So this is like the constant what ifs of what if I had been nicer to that person? What if I had left the house 5 minutes sooner, etc. Next is depression after a loss is one of our body's, again, natural responses to grieving. Feelings of helplessness and intense sadness shouldn't be suppressed, but should be moved through. Depression might not need to be treated in grief unless those symptoms are interfering with your daily life for up to a year after that loss. And if you're feeling stuck in that phase and unable to move forward, again, talking to a doctor or a mental health professional is a good idea. And then lastly, acceptance. This is really the goal phase when coping with grief. This involves accepting the reality of the loss, that it actually occurred, creating a lasting connection with your lost person in the case of a death loss, and moving forward and creating new meaning in your life. This next model is called the dual process model. This is personally one of my favorite models of grief, just for how it kind of illustrates the oscillating between these like loss-oriented and restoration-oriented behaviors. So this was developed in the mid-90s by Margaret Schroeb and Henk Schutt. And this model really highlights how grief, again, is not a linear process, and people are moving back and forth between behaviors that help them cope with their grief and also behaviors that might help protect us from the pain that comes along with grief. So on the loss-oriented side, someone who's grieving might have days where they think a lot about their loved one. Maybe they look at old pictures, they think about memories with that person, or they even go to places that remind them of the person that they lost. On the restoration-oriented side, this might involve actively avoiding seeing old pictures, distracting yourself by watching funny TV shows, going out with friends, or doing chores around the house. So, to recap that, on the loss-oriented side, that's really when you are engaging in activities that remind you of the loss, and restoration tends to be more avoidant. And when someone is in the process of grief, they're often moving back and forth between these two sides pretty often, whether it's on a daily basis, a weekly basis, or monthly basis. So this model really recognizes that these restoration-oriented behaviors, so those more avoidant behaviors, are often a means of self-preservation, and that some days a person who's grieving might not be emotionally capable of thinking about the loss that they experienced. Next is the two-track model of bereavement. So this was published by Simon Rubin in 1981. Initially, this model was created to describe the grieving process of parents who have lost a child, but now it's applied a lot more widely. So in this model, the process of loss and grief is illustrated along two separate but interactive axes. So track one helps the grieving person to examine how they're functioning socially, psychologically, and physically. This really encourages the person who's grieving to assess symptoms of things like anxiety, depression, notice somatic concerns like losing their appetite or trouble sleeping, being cognizant of traumatic responses like PTSD, and also assessing the state of their relationships with their family and friends. On the second track, the grieving person is encouraged to examine their relationship with the deceased or with the loss itself. So this could involve noticing their level of preoccupation with the loss, imagery and memory of the loss, positive or negative feelings about the loss, and the level of desire to reconnect with the person or thing that was lost. So really this model might be helpful to some people who are in a process of active grieving as a reminder to check in with both how you're functioning physically and emotionally, kind of at that base level, and also to examine your thoughts and feelings about that loss itself. The last model we're going to cover is the task of mourning. So this was developed by a psychologist named William Worden, and this is really a framework of the four tasks that can help people move through their grief. So Worden's tasks are really widely accepted among experts in grief and loss, and this framework kind of poses that grief can move forward once a bereaved person addresses these tasks, again, not in any particular order, and kind of moving back and forth between one to another over time. So the first task is to accept the reality of the loss. Without recognizing the fact that someone has died or that a loss has occurred, people tend to remain stuck in the lowest points of grief. Task 2 is processing the pain of grief. As I've kind of mentioned throughout the presentation and hinted at, grief is experienced emotionally, cognitively, physically, and spiritually. And in the first few months after a loss, it involves a lot of pain. So experts in grief and loss generally advise against seeking dulling this pain, whether it be via substances, medications, or other treatment. And instead, it really is recommended that people who are grieving acknowledge that pain and move through it. If serious symptoms, again, of that grief are lasting for up to a year, or if a person is at risk of harming themselves or someone else, then that's really when treatment is likely needed. Task 3 is adjusting to a new world without the person or the thing that was lost. This might involve adapting to a new identity or even taking on new responsibilities and skills that someone else used to take care of. Task 4, which is typically the final task, is creating a balance between remembering the person or thing that was lost and finding new meaning and moving forward with your life. This task doesn't mean that grief is finished, tied neatly with a bow, because as we know, grief is a lifelong process. But it does mean that the grieving person has reached a point where they can healthily move forward with their life and function really well from a day-to-day basis. So now that we've looked at these 4 different models of grief, it's important to note that no model is exactly a right or wrong description of the experience. These models might really resonate with some people and not with others, but having more tools to explain the grieving process can be a source of comfort for many. So while the previous models paint pretty concise pictures of different ways that grief can look, we also know that grief often gets complicated. So certain stigmatized or non-socially recognized losses can go unrecognized and unvalidated in a process that's known as disenfranchised grief. This means that the grieving person is not recognized as having experienced a loss by others. This can make moving through those tasks of mourning really difficult, as social support is often lacking, and it might lead that grieving person to question if their loss was even real or if it's valid for them to feel upset about a loss. Some examples of disenfranchised grief include the death of a non-family member or spouse. So for example, losing a close friend. Typically, workplaces are not going to grant leave for these types of losses, even though they may feel just as devastating as the loss of someone who's biologically related to you. Disenfranchised grief can also occur when the cause of the death is taboo. For example, losing a spouse to suicide or a drug overdose, or losing a child to miscarriage. People often struggle to find the right words to recognize these types of losses, and might not say anything at all because of that. And therefore, that grieving person who experienced loss is disenfranchised. Lastly, non-death losses are often disenfranchised. Things like a breakup or a divorce, experiencing infertility, losing a job, or moving away from home. They can cause us to experience all of the same symptoms and emotions that come along with a death loss, but they may not be recognized as serious or as valid as those death losses. So for some people, feelings of loss are debilitating and don't improve even after time passes. So this is summarized in the umbrella term of complicated grief. It's sometimes also called persistent complex bereavement disorder. So in complicated grief, painful emotions are so long-lasting and so severe that you have trouble recovering from that loss and resuming your own life. Complicated grief can look a few different ways. So first, prolonged grief. This means that someone is continuing to experience those intense symptoms of grief that typically occur in the first few months after the loss. They're continuing to experience them for up to a few years at a time. Mass grief, as I mentioned earlier, means that someone might appear to be managing their emotions really well. You know, they're going out, they're smiling, they're laughing, but they might be experiencing those physical symptoms of grief, or maybe even turning to substances or other negative coping mechanisms to kind of deal with that loss. Lastly, delayed grief. So this might mean that someone didn't have the opportunity to grieve adequately immediately after the loss occurred. So in delayed grief, if someone experiences a kind of secondary loss later on, you know, for example, you have a breakup maybe 2 years after one of your parents died, that response to that breakup, that secondary loss, might be really intense and even exaggerated because the grief from the previous loss was suppressed. So in the case of complicated grief, it's typically lasting for up to a year. And this is really when, again, it's recommended that people might seek treatment. And we're going to talk more about this in the next slide. So I know I've been hitting at this over and over and over again, but experts in grief and loss generally advise against seeking treatment for uncomplicated grief, especially in those first few months after a loss. Recognizing and feeling the pain of the loss without trying to numb it has been shown to be effective in moving people forward through that grief. On the other hand, if grief is complicated or disenfranchised, or if those symptoms of grief are lasting for up to a year and negatively impacting your life, then this is cases when treatment might be helpful. So generally, people who are looking to treat symptoms of grief will seek psychotherapy, medication, or a combination of them both. In therapy, the goals around treating grief involve improving your coping skills, reducing feelings of blame or guilt that you might be holding, and becoming less distressed by thoughts or images of a loved one, and also adjusting to that loss and redefining your life goals moving forward. Lastly, antidepressants might be prescribed to help some people who have clinical depression already, in addition to complicated grief. Medication may also be prescribed for people who are experiencing prolonged issues with their sleep or some of the other physical symptoms of grief. All right, so we're going to shift gears a little bit now and talk about coping with grief in the practical sense. So whether you or someone you know is grieving, it can be really helpful to learn some coping skills and tips for also talking about death and loss. So as you're moving through your grief, there are a variety of coping strategies that might be useful to integrate on days where you're feeling really good and also days where you're feeling really low. So first are self-care techniques. So even on the days where you're feeling well, it's still important to integrate some of these opportunities for self-care. This might include managing stress through techniques like meditation or breathing exercise, cooking yourself a well-balanced meal, prioritizing physical activity like taking a long walk outside, or working on developing a new skill. Next, social support can also be really positive for some people who are grieving. So staying connected with the people you enjoy being around, and also accepting help when they offer it. For some people, connecting with a support group or spiritual leaders might also be helpful. Lastly, one important way to cope is to plan ahead when you know that difficult times are coming up. If your loved one's birthday or their death date is approaching, you might integrate more self-care, you might socialize a little more, and or plan some new ways that you can acknowledge or celebrate your loved one when that date does come along. So now, how do we go about talking about death? Many people find it to be really hard. This might be because it brings up feelings about the unknown, fears about our futures, or worries about saying the wrong thing. So when we're open to talk about death and dying, however, we can create some opportunities for really meaningful conversations. Whether it be discussing your own wishes for dying with dignity, talking about a hard loss that you've experienced yourself, or saying things like, I love you, I'm sorry, or I forgive you before it's too late. Whether you're starting a conversation about your own thoughts and feelings about death, or asking a loved one to open up about their experiences, approaching the topic sensitively is always a good idea. Some of the ways that you can start to have these conversations is first, recognizing opportunities to talk about death. Maybe you are having a conversation with friends or family about the death of someone famous or a recent tragedy that happened. This might be an appropriate time to ease into a more meaningful exchange about death. You could also start the conversation by asking questions about others' experiences with death. For example, maybe asking an older relative, what was it like when your parents died? Then it opens up the opportunity for you to ask, what might you like to be different when you're dying? You may want to have discussions about where they keep their important documents, if they have a durable power of attorney, etc. One of the best ways to open up the conversation is also sharing your own experiences. So mentioning a loss that you went through and how you felt can encourage others to talk about their own feelings and emotions. Lastly, always be thoughtful and considerate in these conversations. Limit your opinions about what the person is sharing and just focus on being an active listener. Also, if a person isn't ready to discuss this topic, respect that wish and come back to it another time. So again, a lot of the time people tend to avoid conversations about death because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing. And while there's not a perfect one-size-fits-all solution or approach to supporting someone who's grieving, we wanted to provide some really practical tips for things that you could say and do, and also some things you might want to avoid saying or doing. So starting on the left side with avoiding. We advise against using platitudes, things like, it's part of God's plan, or they're in a better place now. The person who's grieving may or may not believe or agree with this statement, so it tends to be best just to keep those beliefs to yourself. We also really recommend avoiding trying to fix the bereaved person's feelings or emotions, and it's also best to avoid offering unsolicited advice and or comparing your grief experience to their. Last note on this avoid side, a empathetic response rarely ever starts with at least. So if you're curious about learning more about empathy, Brene Brown does a really good video. If you just look up Brene Brown on empathy, she kind of talks about how this phrase at least can really shut out opportunities for connecting with others. Moving on to the right side of things that you can say and do that might be helpful for some people. So one of the best things that you can do to support a grieving friend is just to acknowledge how hard it must be for them. You could also offer up a variety of ways that you can help and let them choose what would be best for them. I actually saw a screenshot kind of circling on social media recently of a text that someone's friend sent them after they experienced a miscarriage. And what the friend did is they listed out 4 different options. They said, you know, I can take your kids out to dinner, keep them entertained for the night. I can go grocery shopping for you and drop some things off at your door. I cannot do anything at all for you, and maybe one other option for them. So what's really amazing about that approach is that it doesn't put the onus or the responsibility on the person who's grieving to say, oh yes, I think this is what I need right now. Because a lot of times those emotions are so intense after that loss that a person really might not know what they need. So being able to provide like a list of things that you would be willing to provide for them and allowing that grieving person to choose what would be most helpful, that can be a really positive experience for some people. Some other things that you can do to support a grieving friend, just let the grieving person decide when they're ready to talk, but be somewhat persistent and checking back in on them occasionally. Lastly, be willing to just sit with silence with them, to hear upsetting emotions, and offer an active ear if they need to air out any thoughts or feelings. And if you're not comfortable with doing that too, that's okay. That's something that you can set a boundary around, and or just leave that off the list when you kind of provide them some options of what or how you might be able to help. So to wrap up this presentation, we again want to acknowledge how difficult this time of year can be for people who are grieving. So throughout the holidays, there's this expectation of feeling joy and happiness, and it can feel really especially isolating to be grieving during this time. The holidays often have a lot of reminders of those who we have lost in the past. So we might notice like an empty chair at the family dinner table. Maybe the person we used to decorate gingerbread houses with is no longer around. Or it could even be that it's your first holiday away from your home. So even during this time of year, it's okay to acknowledge feelings of sadness and longing for someone or something. If you notice these emotions in others, validate them rather than trying to cheer them up immediately. And when you're ready, work on building new traditions or ways to honor and remember those who you've lost. So while the holidays can bring up a lot of pain, they also offer many opportunities to celebrate, to reflect, and to share memories together. So whether you're someone who's grieving right now, or it's just a topic that you're curious about, we have a lot of recommendations for learning more. So on the top, we have 3 podcasts. First, we wanted to recommend All There Is by Anderson Cooper. This one came really highly recommended to me. It includes conversations about losing a mother, the loss of a sibling to suicide, anticipatory grief from an Alzheimer's diagnosis, and more. Terrible, Thanks for Asking is another podcast that allows guests to be honest about how they're really doing. It's often sad and funny, and it discusses a variety of death and non-death losses. Lastly, The Art of Dying Well is run by experts in the field and examines end-of-life care and also bereavement. For books, we wanted to recommend 2 self-help guides and also 2 memoirs about death and loss. First, Bearing the Unbearable acts as a guide for how to honor grief and let it take its course. For our memoirs, we recommend first The Year of Magical Thinking, and second, When Breath Becomes Air. The Year of Magical Thinking is an account of the year following the death of the author's husband, and is now a really classic book about mourning and the experience of grief. When Death Becomes Air details the author's life and death, which was written by battling stage 4 lung cancer. Lastly, How to Go On Living is written by a grief psychologist and acts as a guide to help you move through that mourning process. So I hope that all of you have maybe learned something new about grief, maybe taken away some coping mechanisms that you might want to try out, or just some practical tips for how to start the conversation. It's often hard in our culture today to talk about death in clear terms. We use a lot of euphemisms like passing on, moving forward, losing someone, and to kind of just name it like someone died, there was a death, I had this loss. It can feel really uncomfortable. However, like I said, that's really when those meaningful conversations can start. So we really encourage you to kind of continue exploring this topic and maybe check out some of the resources that are on the slide. Lastly, our next webinar is going to be taking place on the last Wednesday in January, which is the 25th, again at noon Eastern time. And we'll be talking about being a patient to a doctor in a hospital and just healthcare settings in general. And we're going to be talking about your experience as a patient and how you can feel empowered to kind of advocate for yourself in a healthcare setting. Thanks so much for tuning in today.